I'm so pleased today to have Dr. Kernan Manion with me. I thought this would be an excellent topic to talk with him about since he's an expert on career transition and burnout. So, as he knows that my audience consists of physicians seeking a part-time or full-time position or contemplating making a change. And so I thought this would be awesome to talk to him. He's an expert in the area, and we'd start by saying hello.
Well, thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me to be on the podcast.
I've given a little intro prior to the recording here today, but I wonder if you could tell us what you're mostly doing these days in terms of coaching and consulting.
Well, I got into the world of coaching and consulting through the back door, actually, and that was through my own burnout. And so I was in clinical psychiatry working with head injury, spinal cord injury, and you mentioned the whole array of things that I've been doing, PTSD, et cetera. And I had hit the wall of burnout, and I was ready to throw my hands up and get out of healthcare altogether. And then I fell into coaching, and I became a coaching client of someone, and I found it so intriguing, such a helpful model, so much more proactive than psychiatry and illness-oriented medicine. And so I began a coaching program specifically focusing on physicians who are going through burnout and contemplating career transition. And then likewise in consulting, another fortuitous event, I happened to fall into the world of healthcare consulting. A colleague of mine whom I met at a consultant retreat, of all things, told me that he was heading up a project out in Los Angeles at Children's Hospital. And so I tagged along with him, and we got involved in a very fascinating multi-departmental consultation project, much of which had to do with helping people identify what the issues are that they're grappling with and work better together. So that's what I'm doing now.
That's awesome, and it fits right in with the audience in terms of what they're grappling with. There is so much written about burnout; it's just overwhelming. There's articles every day, and I'm a little confused by the whole topic. So, I know we're going to talk about career transition and burnout today because it's a big factor. So maybe you can provide me what your definition of burnout is, or how we might look at it.
Sure. Well, the research on burnout is very fascinating, and the lead researcher is Christina Maslach, and so you'll see lots of references to her piece on burnout. Maslach and Richard Leiter, Leiter, are the lead researchers looking at the phenomenon known as burnout. The concept actually originated some time ago. The psychiatrist Freudenberger had looked at the term, used the term burnout as it was originally referring to people who were burnt out on narcotics. They basically had flattened their psyches with regard to narcotic abuse. And I guess maybe we've got to take a look in the current opioid epidemic of reapplying the term burnout. However, they decided to use this concept of burnout within a helping profession. Now, so anytime you have a syndrome, as you know, it's important to establish some criteria for it. You just can't, generally refer to something and say, oh, that's burnout or that's the flu or whatever. So therefore, you've got to have specific criteria. And over time, what they found was that there are three core components that define burnout. And the way I have adapted Christina Maslach's definition is this. It's an occupational stress syndrome characterized by exhaustion, detachment, and reduced accomplishment that occurs in people who do people work of some kind. Okay, so it's not people who are in factories. It's not people who just do widget sort of stuff. It basically has to do with the interaction of other people. And the higher the involvement with other people and the higher you have a responsibility for their well-being, the higher the risk of burnout. So exhaustion, detachment, reduced accomplishment. And we can talk a little bit more about some of those, some how I break down some of those symptoms in a moment.
Okay, so I guess what I see and others write about and what they see are sort of the end result of that. So, for example, someone's apathetic, they may be depressed, but that's a clinical diagnosis, and burnout is something different.
That's right, exactly. I'm glad you brought that up because burnout is not a clinical syndrome. You won't find it in the DSM-4 or the latest edition, the DSM-5. Rather, you might have something that's called reactive depression. And people actually confuse depression with burnout. So let's go back for a moment and look at this idea of exhaustion, detachment, reduced accomplishment. What does that mean? So exhaustion, when you think about exhaustion, you don't just think about it physically. That's the most common representation. You're really wiped out physically, just like, after you've been on call for 36 hours, you're just kind of like dragging.
Yep.
Well, that's physical exhaustion, but you'll note also that you have cognitive exhaustion as well. You really can't think as clearly. And you also have emotional exhaustion. That is, you don't give a damn. All right. So you're cutting back. So exhaustion means all of those: physical, cognitive, and emotional. Now, likewise, when we talk about detachment, what do we really mean by detachment? Some people use the term depersonalization. Well, detachment basically means pulling away from. And now, again, also what happens in this pulling away from is that we have three manifestations. Physical pulling away from, that basically means I'm calling in ill, I'm not answering the phone, I'm avoiding contact with colleagues. But there's also cognitive detachment, and that is one of the things that showed for me was that I get these psychiatry journals and I'm thinking, oh my God, I just can't even look at this stuff. I'm not interested in it. I don't want to see anything to do with psychiatry, people's problems whatsoever. So that's cognitive detachment. And then there's emotional detachment. And emotional detachment is basically what we mean by compassion fatigue. Okay, that what's happened here is that we have really intentionally, not intentionally, but we have put into place a means to protect us emotionally. So that's where the apathy comes in. Okay, that's where the emotional shutdown comes in. So they each have these three gradations, and then the last criterion, we said exhaustion, detachment, and then the third one has to do with reduced accomplishment. Now, Maslow makes a deal out of saying reduced sense of personal accomplishment, which has more of a connotation of I feel ashamed, I feel unworthy, I feel like a failure. Well, yes, that's important. But in fact, what I've seen in my work here is not only is there a reduced sense of accomplishment, but in fact, people are having decreased productivity. You're not able to carry the same weight that you used to carry. Now, what I've seen with docs in practice, and it certainly was true of me, and that is in order to maintain productivity, what you end up doing is you end up using more energy, okay? So it's just like lifting weights. In order to achieve the same number of repetitions, you really have to exert more energy the second round. But also what happens is you find that you start cutting back on the quality of your work in order to maintain quantity. So here's how that works. Let's say that I know that there's certain components of the history and the physical exam that we're really supposed to go through. But if you're kind of feeling like, I just can't pull it, I got too many patients to see, you start cutting back on parts of the questionnaire of your history taking, on understanding medication interactions, on family history, et cetera. You start cutting back on your physical exam. So instead of really listening, you're kind of going through the motions. And so that's basically maintaining productivity at the cost of quality. And I would say, let's take a look at that. That could be a sign of burnout.
Interesting. So just to follow up on that, so the productivity piece, it's not really, in a sense, you're going to be less effective, right? Because you can't focus, you don't have the intensity, so you're going to have to take more time.
Yes.
And you said also cut back on, or cut corners perhaps, just to achieve the same amount. So then the other consequence might be that you have to take, your family is going to suffer because you need to take time from them in order to just get the same job done.
That is exactly right. And you're not going to be available to them. It is going to carry over into your personal life. So you were asking earlier about the difference between depression and burnout. Depression, let's take a look at this for a moment. So depression occurs independent of your work status. Okay? Mm-hmm. And so you'll find that in a depressive syndrome, the way I try to tease it apart is that independent of anything having to do with your work life or your calling in life, you end up having core symptoms of burnout. And again, they have to do with fatigue, they have to do with low mood or irritability, emotional constriction, etc. But a vacation doesn't necessarily alleviate burnout, and that depression continues from the work site to the home site to the work site. Burnout tends to be, at least in its early stage, to be more situationally related, and that is it's related to our work or related to our career. And so therefore, in the early stages of burnout, what you find is that diversion can, in fact, alleviate the stress. And you will find that the focus, that sense of exhaustion, detachment, roots, accomplishment, is very specific to your work focus. It doesn't apply all across the board to your friendships. However, later in burnout, and I'd like to tell you about this notion of a continuum that I established, but later in burnout, then you'll start to see that there's this very confusing overlap between burnout and depression.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm seeing, like I said, so much more written about it. There are physicians who are complaining about it. But is there evidence that the prevalence is actually increasing, or is it just more of an awareness of it?
Oh, that's a great question. It seems, certainly from the studies that I've seen, that Medscape and some of the other physician recruitment companies have done research on. It seems very clear that there is an upward trend in terms of burnout. Now, let me offer a cautionary note here that while Medscape has been tracking this for several years now and has been seeing that burnout, the symptoms of burnout seem to be approaching 50%. That's 50% of practicing physicians. I have concerns about this methodology here, because no one, Christina Maslach included, has been able to say that these are the threshold criteria. Okay, so that if a person has exhaustion but not detachment or reduced accomplishment, does that mean they're burned out? Right. Or if they have two of the criteria. But then again, what intensity of each of these criteria do you need? So the way I see it is that we're still at a qualitative understanding of what burnout is. And I think we can get lost in some of the details of really trying to quantify it. But let it be sufficient here to say that in your career, if you find yourself, due to your work, that you are increasingly feeling fatigued, that you're increasingly feeling detached, and that the quantity or quality of your work is suffering, then let's say there that you meet the criteria for some level of burnout.
Got it. I just want to follow up on the point you said about what's being written out there about burnout and the prevalence, because I've seen those articles and I think they try to sensationalize it. They'll say, the headline is burnout is growing, and they'll say physicians have the symptoms of burnout. Well, right. Everybody might have one or two symptoms of burnout from time to time. Yes. It doesn't mean they are burnt out or that they have some other clinical diagnosis. So I think there's a lot to that.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this would actually be a good time, I think, to introduce this notion of a continuum. So, we tend to what you were referring to there is people mistaking burnout as though it's some sort of a binary thing, and that is it's either on or off. You either have burnout or you don't. And what I began thinking about is that actually burnout exists on a continuum of intensity and a continuum of impairment. So imagine this for a moment. If on your left-hand side, you imagine a line, left hand to right hand in front of you there. And on the left-hand side is the most burned out. On the right-hand side is the least burned out. Where burnout exists is toward the left side, and where health exists is toward the right side. Now we say, okay, I'm okay. All right, I'm not burned out right now. I'm okay. So, okay, let's say that okay is the absence of burnout. And then over here on your left side there's burnout. Between burnout and okay, there's a stage that I call wear down. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so there's an existence of a diminishment of energy, a diminishment of engagement or involvement. and a diminishment of quantity or quality. Now, those are three phases: okay, wear down, and burnout. But I think also people are not aware of the fact that just because you're okay doesn't mean you're doing well. So we'll take one stage above okay, and that's really well. That's really operating in a state of flow. That's like, oh my God, I love my work. My creativity is flowing, and I just love being here. My work becomes my life, et cetera. That's my energy. Mm-hmm. But guess what? There's another phase on the other side, below burnout. Now, it's not written about at all because it's my own, imagining here of breaking this down into phases. But I think there's a phase beyond burnout, and I call it meltdown. And meltdown is where you've really got severe exhaustion, severe detachment, reduced accomplishment in terms of quality or quantity. And this is what this looks like here. It's a clinical work emergency. So I'll tell you about a doc here who had meltdown, and that is she was a very compassionate, dedicated doc. And you know how group practices go, family practice, internal medicine, whatever. What you're good at or show an interest in, you generally get more of, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's the way it works, all right? So she happened to have an interest in and was good at, but I mean, this wasn't meant to be her life's task, but she was good at those difficult, complex patients that some people go, oh my God, not another whiny, nudgy patient who's going to take all my time. She was good at these. So she ended up getting more of them. And before you know it, they're using more and more of her time. And before you know it, they're tying her up with all sorts of questions, demands, et cetera. So what ends up happening here is that she's gotten herself loaded with these sorts of nudgy, demanding patients. And she finds herself getting more and more hobbled by that, time-wise, et cetera, record-keeping-wise. Before you know it, documentation is falling behind. Before you know it, she's getting more and more flooded. And now she's got lab results that are coming in, and she can't any longer distinguish between normal lab results and those reports that are saying urgent, you need to attend to them right now. Okay, so she's really overloaded. What she did was what will bring any group practice to its knees, and that is she basically told her colleagues, guys, I can't do call anymore. Okay. Indeed. And you know what happens there is that everybody's got to cover. Okay.
Right.
And so they're going like, oh my God. So therefore, what happens here is that burnout, as you mentioned earlier, burnout has this expanding ripple effect on everybody. So that when you break down one part of the machine here of a practice, then, oh my God, the whole practice becomes affected by this. So that's meltdown.
Meltdown. Wow. Yeah, that I've seen something similar to that in the past. We had an internist who was a very, very busy, very good practitioner. I don't know if she had reached the meltdown stage. I hadn't talked to her in detail, but basically she came to us when I was the CMO and said, you're either going to get a hospitalist to take care of all of my hospital work, or I'm moving to another state because I'm about ready to crash. Man, wow. She gave us an ultimatum. We had been thinking about a hospitalist program, and she was so well respected on the medical staff, and it would have been a huge loss. So we cobbled something together in the short term to say, okay, fine, stay in the office. Great. Now, I don't know if that was the ultimate solution for her, but I kind of related to what you said. I mean, these things happen, and you think there might be an earlier time to intervene, but apparently not.
Oh, well, no, I would disagree with that. There is actually an earlier time to intervene. Yeah.
Hopefully there is.
There is indeed. Yeah, we can talk about that.
Let me ask you this, though, before you talk about that. And you, I think, alluded to it, the difference between depression and dementia and so forth, or depression and burnout, rather, not dementia.
Sometimes it feels like dementia.
This issue of it being intrinsic versus extrinsic, I mean, much is written about what's external to the physician. This seems to be triggering it or contributing to it at least. So where do you fall on that in terms of a combination of internal factors versus, let's say, extrinsic factors?
Okay. Well, first of all, let's address the issue of misnomer or a misunderstanding that people had in earlier times, and that is somehow burnout is a deficiency, a personal deficiency, a character weakness. Oh, you're just lazy. You can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. And when I went through my burnout, I really felt that. And I was dealing with high-intensity head injury, spinal cord injury, stroke, chronic progressive neurologic illness, the stuff that's really pretty bleak. and then also dealing with insurance companies who are really predators. And then managed care had just come on the scene, and they were predatory. And it's like you're fighting everybody. Okay?
Right.
So what happens here is that burnout is really, as I said in the definition, it's an occupational stress syndrome. And so when we look at it as a stress syndrome, what you realize is that you can stress anybody. It doesn't matter how strong your constitution is. It doesn't matter if you're the Navy SEAL of the physician world. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter. You can be stressed to the max, okay? You can be broken. And everybody's circumstances are ultimately unique to them. Their construct of the way they practice, their colleagues, their specialty, etc. So there's some elements that are common to people's burnout, and yet ultimately everybody's burnout is a unique configuration of factors. So therefore, when we look at this, when we look at stress, we got to realize that burnout as a stress syndrome is really a stress storm system. Okay, now I want to explain this here for a moment, because what happens too often is that people, when they think about what's causing their stress, they put their finger on something, one or another entity. Oh, that's where my stress is coming from. When in fact, the reality is more often than not that my stress is coming from an accumulation of things going on concurrently, as well as stuff that has already taken a toll on me previously. Mm-hmm. All right. So when you think about a storm system, this is an image that I found really helpful. So, we've had these hurricanes in the Gulf, and so you think of the storm system, you think of the counterclockwise winds, and the meteorologist comes on and says, well, we've got this cold front coming in from the north, and we've got this dry, arid air coming in from the west, and we've got this moisture coming in from the Gulf, and we've got this rainy stuff coming in from the east, and that's what's causing the hurricane. Okay, you say, well, okay, that's interesting, which means that if I understood these factors, these force vectors, if I were God above this whole thing, and I could have control over these factors, I could direct the intensity of the storm, the direction of the storm. I could actually determine the very existence of the storm by understanding the things that are driving the storm. Now, here's the thing. If you take that understanding and you apply that to a stress syndrome like burnout, then what you say is, aha, if I understand the multiplicity of factors that are contributing to my burnout, and I establish a sort of a matrix of causality, then I realize, aha, once I take each of these individually and address what I can, and I prefer that people go after the low-hanging fruit, to get rid of some of the stress load, we realize that what the stress reaction is a cumulative effect, okay? I've got additive stress from this, and this. So therefore, once we can understand causality, we can start to do something about it. So that's why I want to have people, and the coaching that I do, I really think it's very important not only to have a vision of what you wanted out of your career, but also to understand what's making me crazy. Okay. Mm-hmm. So for me, when I was going through my burnout, when I look back at it, okay, what was going on for me was, number one, the sheer emotional wear and tear of dealing with people with refractory illness. Okay. Man, that takes a toll.
Yep.
Okay. And every physician who encounters illness, going back to the world of Sir William Osler, the father of American medicine, he himself went through burnout. And he spoke about the intensity of what it is to be present to patients and to try to maintain a sense of equanimity so that you don't get pulled into the immensity of the suffering. And you are confronting, you yourself as a physician are having an existential challenge, an existential crisis. And that is, I am confronting the enemy. And that is suffering and death and illness. And so how do I deal with that? And you know what? We don't learn any skills about this in med school, or we didn't used to, at least.
Yeah.
So we've got that going on. And then I had the issue of dealing with these nasty insurers going on. And then we had a hospital that's going from a nonprofit to a for-profit, where every burp and movement has to be translated into a profit. Everything's a cost center. And so you're going like, oh my God, this is miserable. And so I just found myself in this swirl of things. So therefore, I think it's really important to take a look at the multiplicity of causality because. And I was also going through a relationship crisis and a family crisis because my dad had a stroke. And it's like, everything's going crazy. The reason why it's important to break it down like this is so that we can take a look at it piece by piece and say, what can I do about this? Okay.
Right.
So because I want to be able to fix something. I don't want to just simply say, okay, well, I'm going to try to do stress management techniques. These are helpful, but I've got to be able to fix something to get something off my plate here.
Yeah, let me see if I can come up with an example, and you can tell me if this is apropos.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of physicians that were working in the hospital when I was a CMO, and we had put in a new EMR, and it was the usual kind of issues. But it just blew me away that routinely they would say, "Yeah, I'm getting out of the office at 5, but I spend 3 hours a night at home doing my medical records."
Right.
And it just seems like, well, that's totally unacceptable. That's not tenable at all. Yeah. And, in spite of having conversations with leadership and so forth, it was like, well, it'll get better. But in the meantime, there's a lot of physicians kind of reaching that point of burnout. And you're right. They could have, improved their coping skills all they wanted to. But the fact is they had no time to do what they needed to do at home.
Right.
And they were showing the effects.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at that for a moment. So let's take that doc. Let's use one sample doc here, and the EMR is introduced. And that doc, let's say, is not of the same technological savvy as someone of a younger generation. So he's a mid to a later career physician, and he loves taking care of patients, or she loves taking care of patients. And bottom line here is that they're now faced with this EMR. So they say, okay, I'll muster, I'll kind of learn how to do it, but they're having a lot of frustration. Then it's taking away from their enjoyment of patient care. So they're carrying around a sense of frustration. Okay, then they're being told by the CEO, you're not up to date on your medical records. Right. And if you don't get up to date on your medical records, we're going to suspend your privileges. And you go like, oh my God. So now the stress increases again. And then I'm being deprived of my patient care, and I'm up against this medical record thing that is making me crazy. And then on top of that, I'm dealing with patients who have just gotten ill or dying, and I'm dealing with the anguish, and I want to be there for them, but I'm being pulled. Okay, so that gives me more of a sense of frustration. But then I just get in the mail a notice from an attorney saying that I'm being subpoenaed. Okay, what does that do to my stress level?
Yes,
okay,
absolutely. I've been there.
Yeah, and I've been there too. And so what we have here is a storm system. And again, we have to step back and say, okay, people, the storm system may be different for everybody, but there are some common elements. And one of the common elements that we see, unfortunately, is this crazy beast called EMR, the electronic medical record, that has just made some physicians pull all of their hair out and say, I just can't deal with it anymore.
Yep. So now you've probably seen a lot of people then that this is one of the triggers for their career transition, or at least a desire to. And I've written in my blog about, well, don't necessarily jump to career transition. There might be other options that you've alluded to, but at some point, if it's external and it can't be fixed, so I don't know, how do you help people sort of sort through that?
Well, again, what I find is that let's go back to the idea of causality. Before we even talk about transition, let me clarify this notion of transition. Transition doesn't necessarily mean getting out of the practice of medicine. Transition can mean changing the way I go about my work. Mm-hmm. And so, therefore, I need to understand what I can and what I can't change. So, you mentioned the EMR. Well, there's some other things that are significant stressors for physicians. For those who are not familiar with the stress-stressor, stress-reaction complex here, if you take an object and you push against that object, the object basically is the stressee. Okay, that's the person experiencing the stress. Mm-hmm. The push is the stressor. And the change in the function of the stressee is the stress reaction. Okay, so when I refer to stressor, I'm referring to those things that are impacting the person being stressed, being impacted by the stress. So therefore, when we look at these things, let's just take a look at a sampling of typical physician stresses. So one we said is the EMR. Okay. Another is the amount of calls that we're doing. Another is the workload during the week that we're having to do. Another has to do with how we work with our colleagues and our medical colleagues, as well as the larger team, nursing, PAs, nurse practitioners, administrators. So all of these are significant stressors. And then what we need to do is we need to say, okay, so those are there, but are they all a given? Or is there anything there that we might do that might help change this? Okay, so let's take a look at that for a moment here now. So we look at, let's take the EMR. All right, so you get your training, the big company comes in and says, okay, you got this, you got this, you got this. And then you're going, oh my God, they left, the training's over, and I'm still having trouble. So some people just say, well, you're on your own, bud. You got to figure it out. Rather, what needs to happen is the medical staff needs to come together and say, some of you guys are really grappling with the new EMR. We know that. We know it's a stress. And so, you know what? We're going to offer a special class or special mentorship to people who really want to learn some of the shortcuts, so that you can get out of these problematic screens without committing fraud. Okay? So how can we do that? So we're going to basically do that for you because we know it's a problem. Let's take the issue of work overload and call. There was a time not too long ago where every doc had to come into the hospital and take care of their patients, okay, on the inpatient and make rounds.
Right.
There was a time not long ago where docs actually had to come into the ER for their own practice patients. Well, guess what? Because of creative thinking, people said, there's a need here for somebody to take care of hospitalized patients. And so therefore the field of hospitalist came into being. There's a need for somebody who's going to specialize in just taking care of patients in the emergency room. And therefore the field of emergency medicine emerged. So what's important to see here is that because when we encounter a problem like this, there are in fact ways to develop a solution to it. I don't think anybody wants to see docs working like slaves to the point that they get burned out and then they get depressed and suicidal or drop out of their careers. Nobody really wants that. But we have to make it a collaborative discussion, not just amongst physicians, but physicians and administrators. This is a group effort that we have to take a look at, okay, what's going on here? Let's take another source here of stress, and that is dealing with the impact of trauma. Now, I really think this is downplayed. I think that somehow everybody expects that dealing with human suffering is just part and parcel of what it is to be a physician, and you're simply supposed to, deal with it. Okay, if you can't deal with the death of an infant in OB, well, then what good are you? If you can't deal with the death of somebody who died in your arms in the ER, well, what good are you? Just get out of the kitchen if you can't take the heat. And what I find here is that no, that's not the case at all. Every one of us who went into this field of medicine is a human being with a very big heart. And we really want to take care of people. And so therefore, the impact of suffering, the impact of pain, the impact of people in distress, the impact of death is huge. And yet we don't still have the means for us to process that.
So it sounds like there needs to be an organizational awareness, a willingness to create some support, and or even the individual to learn how to communicate what they're going through such that they can get the support and incentivize their system or their hospital or their medical group to intervene. So
Exactly. And so if I could comment on that with regard to, some of the approaches to burnout I find to be really quite deficient. So therefore it's, it's a stress, it's a stress syndrome. So therefore, we're going to send you to stress management. Okay. So you're not going to do deep breathing and you're going to do mindfulness meditation. And I don't mean to demean these. These are wonderful. Okay. They really are. They're very helpful. However, they don't address the causes of the stress. So you know what? If I if I have not learned techniques of dealing with hostile patients, then every time I encounter one of these angry, demanding patients who threatens to sabotage my career with a poor rating, then I'm going to get up in, a tremendous amount of stress because I feel powerless. Mm-hmm. Rather, wouldn't it be helpful for me to get some training around how to deal with hostile patients? Mm-hmm. Okay, and so if I'm also grappling with the immensity of suffering and how to deal with people who have refractory illness that I cannot do anything about changing, then doesn't it make more sense for me to get some training in dealing with refractory illness rather than repeatedly going through the trauma of dealing with people dying?
Right.
So therefore, we need to develop specific antidotes to the stresses that are going on. Now, not only that, not only is it limited to just physicians finding the antidotes for themselves, let's take a group practice. Let's say a group practice of orthopedists or cardiologists or family practitioners, whomever. Let's say that this group practice actually needs to have a meaningful discussion about how are we all doing. Now, I know that sounds really wussy, right?
Yeah, right. It's pretty touchy-feely there.
Right, exactly. Like, what group does that? Well, believe it or not, there are some groups that do this. And the whole concept of a corporate retreat, an organizational retreat, is foreign still to many people in medicine. Myself, having stepped out of that and gone into the world of consulting, I realized, guess what? A corporate retreat is not a strange thing at all, okay? An executive level retreat is not a strange thing at all. Okay, so we start to look at, well, what can be done at the group practice level? What can be done perhaps at the organizational level? So we got a hospital here. And the hospital's got an administration that a CEO, COO, CMO, CFO, and just a whole army of mid-level managers, all right? And we got a physician staff, and then we've also got a nursing staff, and we've got PAs and NPs and this whole team of people. But you know what? Very, very little effort is being spent toward creating an opportunity for collateral dialogue around how's this working for all of us. Okay, I understand you want me to get my records done, but you know what? I've only got so many hours in a week and so much home time that I can get these records done. So how are we going to have a dialogue around this? So therefore, I think one of the next things that we really need to be focusing on is getting outside of the thinking that individual physicians have to do this all by themselves. We've got to create vehicles within group practices. We've got to create vehicles within medical staffs as a whole. And we also have to create vehicles between medical staff and administrative staff, coming together dialogues around what's going on, people, how are we dealing with this? Yes, I know it sounds wussy, but you know what? Without doing it, we're not going to be able to fix the problems collaboratively. And they call for a collaborative solution.
Well, I mean, if the statistics are anywhere near accurate in terms of what this is doing, in terms of the volume of people affected, and you're going to start to lose your physicians, your systems are going to, we're seeing it. I mean, the turnover in some places is unbelievable.
Yes.
The other thing that I would remind those who are listening who maybe are in hospital and medical group administration is that you definitely should adopt something like this, number one. And number two, you should pay for it. Meaning it's professional development. It's part of their job. And so don't say they have to do this on their own time on a Saturday afternoon. This has to be something that you're supporting financially as well as, for in terms of time.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up because somehow it is believed in the healthcare sector as opposed to the non-healthcare corporate sector. Somehow it's believed that employee training you're supposed to develop all of these skills on your own. So team development skills, communication skills, conflict resolution skills, understanding personality styles in the workplace. Somehow you're supposed to have acquired all of this stuff. And, I love to think of it in terms of a mechanical model for a moment. When an organization buys an MRI machine, they can only buy that MRI machine, whether it's from GE or Siemens or whomever, they can only buy that MRI machine with a maintenance contract. You have to pay for the maintenance contract, okay?
Right.
And you have to pay for training, and you have to pay for downtime to service the machine. That's kind of like, you want our machine, this is the way it works best. If you break the terms of the contract, namely you don't do the maintenance, like we told you, and you don't do the training of the personnel, the contract is null and void, okay? And you just ruined a gazillion-dollar machine. And I think we need to be looking at it from the same standpoint with regard to physicians. Physicians are incredibly well trained, okay? And they're like Swiss watches, and we're taking a hammer to them and saying, speed up the time.
Right. Yeah, and that's not a good recipe.
No. The recipe for disaster. Yeah, exactly.
So maybe you can sort of tie this then back into this career transition and give some advice or thoughts on where the two intersect. When is the career transition actually the appropriate move, and maybe when it's not the appropriate move, if you can give some input on that.
Sure. Oh, yeah, sure. So we've been speaking a little bit about burnout here, and burnout is I would say it's one of the leading causes of people seeking career transition. And in this case, career transition, I mean actually getting out of clinical healthcare altogether, because it just feels like I can't manage it. It looks like there's no green grass on the other side. It's like I just got to get out of here. But I do want to stress that there are other reasons why people make a transition. Sometimes it's simply a lifestyle transition because they might have a disability and they need to accommodate that disability. Sometimes it's because they're saying, you know what, this isn't meeting my heart's needs, and I want to find something that really does meet my heart's needs. So there are several reasons why people go through career transition. So first of all, I would say that it's important to understand in transition that you don't want to wait to a time where you're simply so frantic that you feel like you're on top of a burning building and you have to leap.
Right.
Okay, so that's where the pain is so great. And I can tell you, I've made just about every mistake in the book in terms of career transition. And so that's why I feel like I can speak with some degree of authority. I let mine get to the point of misery. And I would say, quite frankly, I think I let mine get to burnout and depression. Okay. I grappled with both concurrently. And you can have both concurrently, but the approaches are different. Okay. The approach to burnout is a coaching, pragmatic approach. The approach to depression is more of a clinical approach that may or may not involve therapy and medication. All right. So therefore, then, I came up with a model that I found really useful to help people think through career transition. So imagine this for a moment. We got a push-pull dynamic here, okay? And you got forces that are propelling you toward change, and then you've got forces that are equally resisting your change. And what I found in seeing people who are going through a career transition is most often, the reason why they're seeking help is because they're stuck. Okay, I was stuck. I was in misery, and yet I stayed on the hospital staff. Okay, I was stuck. But what I found was that, okay, if we can understand these forces, then we can really help people make a successful transition. So here are the four forces. So you take a line, and I'm going to, again, use my left hand. So start the line at your left hand. You're going to draw a circle in the center of a page, okay? And above the circle, from your left arm to your right arm, you draw an arrow, and the arrow is facing toward your right hand. That's the change driver. And then you do another arrow the opposite way at the bottom of the circle, and that's the change resistor. And so we're that person in the center there going against these forces. Now, you bisect both of these lines. So you go to the top arrow, and you break it right in the middle there, and you put a little arrowhead right in the middle, and you do the same for the bottom one. So now we've got an upper left arrow and an upper right arrow that are both heading toward the right. And we've got a lower left arrow and a lower right arrow that are heading toward the left. Okay, the one in the upper left is what I call the pain driver. Okay, that's driving us toward change. That's where burnout fits in. That's where my anguish fits in. And it's very important to understand what the nature of my burnout is. As I said, we really got to sort it out, not only to see what we can fix, but even if we're going to get out of clinical care altogether, we got to make sure that the thing that's driving us crazy is we're not going to replicate it in some other position.
Right.
Okay, now the second, the upper right-hand quadrant, is also a change driver, and that's what I call longing. That is basically having to do what is pulling us forward. It's inviting us forward. It's saying, boy, wouldn't you rather be doing this? Isn't this your ideal? So it's the one that's beckoning us forward. Now, unrealized longing is itself a form of pain. It's a form of frustration. Like, I really want to be doing this, but I can't get there. I feel blocked. Right. Okay, so pain and longing are the two main change drivers. Now, if everything was fine there, you got a lot of pain, you got a lot of longing, why aren't you making movement? And the reason why you aren't making movement is because of change resistors. And what are the two big change resistors? In the lower right-hand quadrant there, the biggest change resistor is what I call real-world considerations. Okay, we're up against reality, and the reality is, hey, wait a minute. I got 2 mortgages. I got a kid in private school. My wife loves the community. I got a non-compete clause with the group, and I can't get out of it for 3 years. I'm stuck here. Okay, these are real-world considerations that need to be explored, but they shouldn't be taken as firm realities. They need to be taken as possible resistors that might be able to be negotiated. And then the fourth one here, the fourth one in the lower left-hand corner, is a quadrant that I found is really sneaky, and it's probably the most elusive one to get a hold of, and that is what I call self-myth. And self-myth means these are the stories that we tell ourselves that we accept as true and act on as true, but are not necessarily true. So here's an example of that. When I was at the hospital working with head injury, spinal cord injury, okay, it's a relatively specialized area of psychiatry, rehabilitation psychiatry, okay, and so here I am dealing with these fancy mental status instruments and dealing with neurologic illness and the psychiatric aspects of multiple sclerosis and the psychiatric aspects of traumatic brain injury and the neuropsychiatric aspects of stroke, and I'm thinking to myself, you can't leave this because you know this, okay? You're one of the few people who understands this, and you can't leave these patients hanging, okay? Mm-hmm. So I was telling myself this, and I was basically enrobing myself in the mantle of martyrdom, okay? And so, you really owe it to yourself, but it took me a year to come to the understanding that, yeah, you're a good guy and all of that. But bottom line here is I was scared to make the transition. What was really going on was that I was frightened because I didn't know what else I would do, okay? And the big world out there was really frightening. So I was using this myth as a means of avoiding the change that I needed to go through. So I find that 4-quadrant transition to be a very useful model for people.
I like the model, and as you were discussing the various components, I thought, well, maybe I should use myself as an example and see if this sounds right to you.
Yeah.
It might be helpful for others. So there was a point where I was contemplating becoming, pretty much a hospital manager or medical advisor or something. Mm-hmm. So if I look at the pain, I think it related to I was getting frustrated with patients. I was a guy who could never say no, like you mentioned earlier, and basically I was accumulating very whiny, needy patients, and they were starting to wear on me, and the tedium of practice was a pain.
Right. Yep.
At the same time, I did have an interest in population health, public health, epidemiology, statistics. I wanted to help a larger group of patients, so that was kind of the longing part. And I had the real-world considerations you mentioned, like responsibilities, basically.
Right.
And then the self-myth, I don't know if you consider these self-myths, but things like, who am I to do this? What qualifications do I have? And let's see, one other, that I've heard from others, not so much me, but it's similar to what you said. I've invested a lot of money and time in this career. It would be wrong of me to leave this career.
Yes.
So
A very common self myth that after all the time I put into this, oh my God, what a waste. I took somebody else's place in med school. After all this
You're
money
right.
that I and my family put in there, what a loser I am to even be considering transition. Yes, in fact, that is a very powerful self myth. It's a shaming myth that keeps people stuck in their misery.
I think we might have to have an entire episode on just how to eliminate that myth from one's thinking, because there's a lot of people that fall prey to that.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, in coaching, it comes up a lot. And I work with people around doing some reflective exercises, some journaling around, let's take a closer look at that. And it's very useful for people to say, whoa, 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 I've been living with this myth, this shaming myth. And how about if I approach myself from a spirit of compassion? The Buddhists speak about self-compassion, and I love the concept. And that is that in the same way that I see myself as a compassionate person to others, how about if I apply those same principles to self-compassion?
That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, my.
Yeah. So, and there's a couple of other things that I just thought about that I wanted to mention about dealing with this notion of burnout and career transition. As a group, as physicians, we have a tendency to be isolated, and we have a tendency to hold our cards very close to our chest. I don't want anybody else to know that I'm struggling or suffering, but look at the data here. Let's take some degree of validity that a significant proportion of physicians across the spectrum are really grappling with burnout. You know what? We need to have more of an opportunity to have a dialogue amongst ourselves about what are you doing to help alleviate burnout. And so I'm very encouraged to see your podcast in taking a look at this and creating that kind of a dialogue.
Excellent. I did a little short, I was driving to the office the other day, and I was just thinking about this, and it just occurred to me that, physicians are in such an important position in in their communities, in the country.
Yeah.
And, to think that so many are burnt out, unhappy, disillusioned, it's just sad, and it needs to be addressed. And so we can all do our part, hopefully, whether it's here or what the work that you're doing with your coaching and so forth, for sure. So it has to be addressed, though.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And, this notion of coaching, I just want to note that people, when they look around, how can I get help with this? They say, well, maybe I should go into therapy. And so I'm a shrink, board certified, and I want to caution people about that. Yeah, I think therapy is very important and very helpful for self-discovery as well. But I can tell you from talking with my mental health colleagues, they are not really equipped with taking a very pragmatic coaching approach to burnout and helping people systematically examine their burnout. Therapists, mental health people have a tendency to frame everything in the context of mental illness. Oh, you have depression. Oh, you have anxiety. And therefore, they go down a clinical frame. And I think, no, that's not really what's needed right now. What's needed right now is a sounding board, a safe space, somebody to help bring order to your suffering, somebody to help bring a framework of understanding of what you can do, someone who has a good understanding of what's going on in medicine today. So that's where I think coaching really comes in very helpful.
I've not been a coach, but from what I understand, I mean, you're helping the individual have some insights into what's really available that they just haven't recognized. Is that correct?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. What you're doing is you're creating a forum to say, okay, let's see if we can sort this out. Because, one of the things that's going through, a physician goes through in burnout is nobody will understand. And so what you're really doing is you're creating an opportunity to be heard and to make sense of, and not just to spout off, nor not just to vent and get a lot of sappy emotional support. Rather, it's really a safe space to make sense of. And to have somebody there who can say, I'm hearing where that's coming from. What can we do about it? Okay, how can we go about approaching this in a systematic way? So yeah, and a physician coach can really help somebody sort through. Well, look, here are some areas that you might want to be thinking about. So for example, this notion of picking a career, picking an alternate career. How do you do that? Well, unfortunately, without guidance, physicians say, I'm so sick of being a doc. I'm going to open a hamburger joint. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I've always wanted to be a restaurant operator.
Or how about a bar?
Or a bar, exactly. Oh yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Well, what happens here is that someone hasn't really articulated what are my interests and what are my passions, what are my skills, what are my talents. What are my values? What do I stand for? What don't I stand for? What won't I stand for? And those things really need to be sorted out before one can consider, okay, would this non-clinical career be a match for me? If we just simply make a random jump and say, oh, I'm going to work for an insurance company doing disability evaluations, or I'm going to be an expert witness, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. If you haven't done that systematic thinking about where your heart and soul are and what your needs are, then you're liable to be jumping from option to option to option. And the more you do that, the more your franticness, your frenzy is going to increase.
Mm-hmm. I'm aware of one or two that have followed that path, and it was not very pleasant by any means.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I've taken you too much of your time today, somewhat, I think, but it's been really very interesting and very helpful. So I'm going to say, let's, how do you want to wrap things up here in terms of advice to our listeners, what they should think about if they feel, I guess, if they feel possible burnout is driving this need to change their career, maybe just some high-level points based on what you've already mentioned.
Sure. Well, what I'd recommend is, first of all, I want to let physicians, my colleagues, know the work we do is holy, it's sacred, it's not just a business. And we need to understand that, and we need to understand that the investment we put into our careers is very valuable. We also need to understand that we're not going through this alone. Okay, that, as I said, Medscape is documenting that upwards of 50% of physicians are going through varying degrees of symptoms of burnout. And there are a lot of physicians who are going through discontent that is not burnout. They're just basically saying, this is not the field I signed up for. Okay, mm-hmm. So to recognize that, and to recognize that, you know what, it's complex, and there is an approach to helping sort it out. That you don't want to let your life get so stressed where you make an impulsive decision. That there are resources out there where a coach can help somebody sort through the issues that are causing the burnout. A physician can seek a guide, a coach who is familiar with the territory of career transition, and say, okay, let's think this through systematically. And all things considered, it is a really economical investment of 6 or 8 sessions to get one a good start. Okay, not a lifelong process. We're talking about 6 to 8 sessions to just simply get a framework in place so that you've made definitive work on how I can move forward from this. And there are some really wonderful opportunities out there. And you know what? With physicians making these changes, by doing so, they are forcing the system to change. They're bringing about change. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's wonderful advice. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all the time you spent. How can we get a hold of you, or how can my listeners find you, or if they want to learn more or see what you're up to?
I'd love to share that with you. Kernan Manion, MD, Kernan Manion, Manion, MD.com. Of course, there's a www in front of that. Yep. So there's a contact form on there, or you can just write me a direct email at Dr. K, DRK, and no period in there, DRK at, and then my website address, KernanManionMD.com. On there, I'm offering, I've already offered, and I will share with you, John, that I'm offering a couple of webinars coming up. One actually is on understanding the burnout phenomenon and what physicians can do about it and what organizations can do about it. This is a webinar that I think would not only appeal to physicians, but also to hospital administrators and insurance company executives, for that matter. So that'll be one. And I'm right now, I'm tentatively scheduled for Monday, November the 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern. And I'll have that on my website. And then on the 13th, what I'm doing a webinar on is the 4-quadrant model of career transition that I went through there: the pain, longing, real-world considerations, and self-myth. And a handout will go along with that to provide a basic workbook for people to do that work. So I would love to hear from any of your listeners. Even if they want to just sound out, there's no obligation whatsoever. I'm happy to offer a free consultation to everybody who calls and set up a meeting.
That sounds like a great opportunity for anyone who's finds himself in a situation similar to what we've talked about today, for sure. So I will put that information in the show notes for sure.
Great.
But even just listening, it sounds like it's pretty simple to get a hold of you. So I would encourage anyone who's kind of feeling like they don't know which direction to go to consider reaching out and check out the webinar. I'm going to see if I can make those myself. All right, Kernan, I really have enjoyed this hour. It went through very quickly. It was great. A lot of information here, so I really appreciate the time that you've spent with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, John. It's really been an honor and a pleasure, and continued well wishes on this podcast. I think you're doing a great thing with this. Thank you.
I really appreciate that, and thanks again for being with us.
All right, take care now.
All right, bye-bye.